resist. So, James Landay, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Dan. I'd say I'd give more credit to that lunch to the late guy, Boyella, who was a great friend to Dan and I, who's no longer with us, who really was always full of life. So this project is called the Smart Perimeter, which I'm sure is relevant to some things you're doing. It's a large project now at Stanford, but only formally going for 1 year. So we've had funding that started pretty much January of last year. And before that, it was just me kind of noodling on it for a few years when I first started thinking about it, and working with a couple undergraduates in the summers, doing a little piece, but always kind of restarting again, because that's how it happens when you do kind of undergraduate research. But now in the last year, I've really been joined with other faculty and students and postdocs at Stanford, the key being Emma Brunskill in computer science, who does AI applied to education, and then also out of the Graduate School of Education, Roy P., and the Dean of Graduate School of Education, Dan Schwartz. So it's now a collaborative project. But I want to first start off with a little bit of a story about where it came from and how I started to think about this. So around that time of that dinner in Florence, maybe a couple of years later, I spent a 2.5-year sabbatical in Beijing while I was on the faculty at the University of Washington. Usually sabbaticals are only 1 year, but we loved living in Beijing so much that we extended it a little while longer. And one thing that I really enjoyed about living in China was how historical stories actually come into even business conversations. And so the one story I like to tell is about this horse. This is the great heavenly steed. It's one of the most famous relics in China. It's from the Han Dynasty. It's about 2,000 years old. It's in solid bronze. It's about this big. And it wasn't uncovered until just about 50 years ago. And it really puzzled the scholars for a while who studied it, because the legend behind this horse was that the horses of the west of China were so fast that they literally flew. So if you look at this horse, its hooves are in the air except for this one hoof, which is actually hard to tell here, but the base of the statue is actually a swallow that's looking back in horror, kind of as it's being stampeded as it's flying in the air. And this is cast in solid bronze, and if you see it, you'll notice that the statue is not very symmetrical. The head's off to one side, and so they were really unsure how 2,000 years ago did they make this out of bronze and not have it just fall over. And so for me, this statue is interesting in that it represents balance. In this case, it's the balance between the science of being able to maybe calculate the center of mass of this, and the artistry of the actual artifact and the beauty of it. And I think the same kind of balance between art or design and technology is what we need to create products that people will want and desire and work. And so in my research at Stanford, as well as in the courses that I teach, I try to make sure that students have some knowledge in both these sides. So I actually teach in a computer science department, so technology is what they're getting all the time. So I'm trying to infuse more design into what they do. And so you'll see in this project us trying to push on both parts of this. Sometimes not successfully, they get out of sync and we have to kind of pull them back together. And another interest that came out of this time in China for me was also trying to understand the differences between Eastern and Western culture and how that actually can lead to new ideas. So when I worked in China for 2.5 years, I was a visitor at Microsoft Research there in Beijing, and I noticed that having different experiences sometimes led to confusion, but sometimes those confusions actually led to new ideas that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so I've been interested in both how mixing different cultures can lead to innovation, as well as how, from a user interface design, to be able to understand how to design for different cultures and how it's different. And so some of that has come into this. So one thing that was going on while I was living in China in about 2010 or 11 was there was an international examination called the PISA examination, and they have middle school students take this. And the Chinese students came in first place in the world on this. And I remember at the time that the Chinese president was making a major visit to the US, and this news was in the news, like we're really falling behind, look what's going on. The Chinese kids even beat us in English. Why is this? Now, for one thing, it may not have been a totally fair assessment. I know the middle schools that were used in China were some elite schools around Shanghai, and the US schools were more of a cross-section. But nonetheless, it was kind of an interesting moment. It was also the same time that the Tiger Mom book came out, and that was really being pushed in the Wall Street Journal to really get people really uptight about what's going on. Are we educating our kids wrong? Now, what was interesting to me, though, that when I spoke to a lot of people about this in China, instead of hearing everyone like, yeah, we're number one, this is great, a lot of people I spoke with said, hey, our education system is really based on conformity and efficiency. In some ways, we've created a factory system, just like the factories creating all the iPhones and things like this, and it's not really focused on innovation. So some people didn't actually think this result was all that important, and that the education system was out of whack in some ways towards this direction. At the same time, in the US, you would almost see the opposite reaction. So, for example, there was a broad foundational report saying 68% of US 8th graders can't read at grade level, most will never catch up. And it was interesting to me to see kind of the education reactions in both countries, at least from more the elite folks, were both seeing themselves on this extreme and wanting to find more balance. So in China, yes, we can do the basics in reading, writing, math, and science, but we need to get more innovation. In the US, I never heard anyone saying, hey, our kids aren't creative, but instead it was, hey, we need the basics, and we need to go back to the basics. So this lack of balance was interesting to me. And at the same time, I was starting to think about education as my children were at that point in elementary school, and I kind of started to really wonder, hey, really is school a factory system that's really about efficiency, producing the workers that were needed at the turn of the 20th century, rather than really educating people? And in fact, started to really wonder, yes, most of us in this room, or most that I will ever see at a place like Berkeley or Stanford, are people who are really good with the current system, but there are a lot of people who are left out because it just doesn't appeal to them, it doesn't motivate them. So how might we think about other ways of learning? So at the same time, when I was living in China, the first iPad came out in 2010. And even though it was made in China, I couldn't buy it in China. I remember I had to take a trip to DC for the National Science Foundation, and one of those mornings I got up and went out to Crystal City, Virginia, or one of these places, and waited in line so I could get this iPad, because to me this was like an amazing device. And Dan knows I worked on these kind of pads and things like he did many years ago at Xerox and other places, so it was very exciting. But it also reminded me, when I got this device, of this book that I had read back when it came out in 1995 by Neil Stevenson. Many of you, I'm sure, have read it, called The Diamond Age. And I remember when I read this book, because although I'm not a big sci-fi aficionado, a lot of my friends in graduate school at the time at Carnegie Mellon read this book, and I read it, and we all thought, whoa, that would be a really interesting model of learning that was described in that book. And in fact, my friends at the time were some of the top AI and machine learning people in the world. There, some new Tom Mitchell students, other people who knew their stuff, and we all felt what we read was something that was what we would at the time call AI complete. Or you would say, hey, you need AGI today to do this. So we kind of just dismissed it as cool, but you couldn't build that, too hard. But when the iPad came out, that was 15 years later, it got me to start thinking about this primer in this book. And I like to say, this is the weirdest subtitle of a book I've ever seen, in small letters, or, comma, a young lady's illustrated primer, like a British school book. It's like, it's almost like he makes it stand out on purpose by making it different in that way. And to me, that's really what the book is about, much more than the nanotechnology, the diamond age itself. And I started to think about the problems and how you might build this thing. And I started to think, wow, the technical issues that I thought were there were still there, but were maybe doable. Because in that 15 years, We started to have educational tutors, like the geometry and algebra tutors that came out of Carnegie Mellon and the offshoot Carnegie Learning that had succeeded. We already had Khan Academy had already started. Wikipedia was now like all over the place. There was a lot of content. So I started to think that a lot of the technical pieces behind it were there, and some that were really hard. For example, I noticed when my kids write something in school, they wouldn't really get much feedback from the teacher. How could you get really good feedback on an essay? And at that time, I wasn't thinking we would do that with AI, but then I started to think, well, you could crowdsource that. So I started to think that the problems from the technical side of this were actually something we could tackle. And what I started to think about was the hard part, which I didn't really anticipate back in 1995, kind of funny given that I was an HCI person, was the design and the story and the engagement is kind of the harder part. Like, how do I get somebody who's actually going to read your story for months or years seems to be the harder part to me. Now, that's not to say we don't know how to do that. Obviously, if you have any teenagers, they can play certain video games 4 years, I think, at least in my household. So some people have cracked that in games for sure. So I started to think about this. And I started to think about, could we brainstorm different kind of educational activities that we could embed within a story and get children to learn as part of this engagement in the story. So for example, maybe these kids here are kind of making these toy frogs jump across the living room floor and then measuring how far the jumps are and maybe calculating the average. Or this student in Palo Alto is measuring how much rain they get in 3 months or a year and noticing that's the same as Seattle in 1 week. My former Seattle friends. So how might we do that? And so one of the research techniques that I like to use in my group these days is think about a problem, but instead of going out and spending 3 to 5 years trying to do the hard research and building it, we do first is create a concept video. So this is a concept video that Stanford undergrads who were working with me did in about 4 to 6 weeks, 3 summers ago, as we were starting to finally go, hey, let's try to think about this project. So this is kind of really the kickoff to seriously doing the project. So again, this represents what our ideas were at the time, and it's meant to give us a way of prototyping our ideas by writing the script and trying to shoot it, and then also getting feedback when we show it to people, and be able to do that in 6 weeks or 8 weeks instead of 5 years, which building a real artifact might take. So I'm going to show you what we were thinking about at that time. uncovered some of the mistakes actually in our thinking. So the basic idea that we came up with was, could we tie narrative with some fun educational activities that are somehow embedded in it and put it on a personal media device that a child would control and be portable and mobile outside, and then use things like physical surroundings, location, and other contexts to help make the story come alive and engage them more. So just to give you a roadmap of where I wanted to go here was I wanted to describe the first smart primer prototype that we created kind of almost around the same time as that video or soon afterwards, and show what we did there and what some of the things we learned from it that really kind of is driving some of the research questions we have today. And then I'm going to talk about chatbots for learning, which is one piece that came out of that early experience that we've done a lot of work on. And then I want to end with kind of giving you an idea of what our current design and how learning is embedded in it. And then also, if we have time, just some of the information extraction and question generation technology, but that stuff's pretty new and not yet published, but I'll just kind of give you an idea of what's going on. So the first prototype we did was to build a one-chapter prototype. And the basic idea was, first of all, when you think about having many months or years of use of such a device, how are we going to write any stories that go that long was kind of a problem for me. Now, one way was, could we just take somebody else's books and license content or something like that? It's not usually a thing we can easily do in the university. I started to think about, okay, what are the books that my kids might read for years? And I started to think about, there's these series, you know. The one that comes to most to mind to me is the Magic Treehouse series. Anyone familiar with those books? Right? They have this trick. The trick is these kids go back into the forest by their house and they go to this treehouse and there's all these books. And any book they pick lets them travel in space and time. So they can go back to the dinosaurs, or they can go to ancient England, to King Arthur's table, all this kind of stuff. So that trick lets you have a set of characters, but be able to move all over space and time. Makes it easy to create a lot of books. You'll see this in a lot of other series, this same kind of trick. So we assumed such a trick without actually going too deep into it. We said, okay, we're going to find some kind of trick like that. And instead we just wrote this first story. So I had a really talented undergraduate, Griffin Dietz, who's now a PhD student, and actually you guys should talk to her about summer internship. I know she's looking for something. And she said, oh yeah, I like to write stories. And I said, oh yeah, what kind of stories do you write? She said, when I was in middle school, I wrote a couple of novels. They're not published or anything, but they were pretty long. I said, you know what, 20 pages, 30 pages? And she said, no, each of them are about 150 pages typed, word. And I was like, okay, maybe she can write. So she took a first crack at this, and she wrote a story in which the child using it is embedded into the story. They travel back in time, and they're in this city in ancient Greece, and they need to help solve a crisis. So the king has commissioned a crown, but he fears the jeweler may have stolen some of his gold and replaced it with another metal. And so we start into the background of the story, some history about it, and then the child gets there and sees what's going on. There's commotion. Eventually they meet this candy man and start working with him as an apprentice and doing some things, and they need to do a task where they have a math activity. So they have to measure the volume of a box and help the confectioner get some information about it, and eventually meet this other guy named Archimedes. And we give the child some simple tools to figure out how to solve this problem, and then eventually they get to some science where we have a bottle, and they have one filled with air and one filled with dirt, so we're looking for things that they can easily get around their home, and they start to learn about volume and density, and that's kind of the basic learning activity in this story, because it all ties back to this Archimedes story and trying to determine whether the crown is actually made out of gold or not. So it gets pretty detailed in terms of the stuff the child does. And we tested this prototype 2 summers ago with about 12 kids, ages 10 to 12. And what did we find out? Well, we found out that was too long, it was too hard, And in fact, as kind of we expected originally, but we did find out that even with kids with kind of this tight range in ages, their reading levels really varied. Some people found it, just too sophisticated for them, and some it was not. And also the interest levels varied. Like there was some kid out there playing with the water and the fountain and the dirt. He loved it. And then there was another kid who was like, do I really have to go outside? So even there, kind of finding something that's going to satisfy all is likely not to happen. And we kind of expected it because we want to make this more personalized, but hadn't actually done anything there yet. So we've since revised and iteratively tested that story, and we have 2 different versions, have different levels of complexity of the activities, etc. But that first prototype and actually getting it out there and testing with kids kind of raised some of the research questions that we've been following as we create the next version of this. So one of these, in some ways, was in my mind already, and we haven't yet solved it, but does a compelling narrative motivate students to engage in learning activities? It's kind of an assumption of the project, but it's an assumption that I think we need to test a little bit, though there is some prior work that maybe says it's true. So we want to have a better understanding of what makes narrative compelling or effective in the first place, and then building on that, we want to study narratives that have these embedded activities versus just the activities alone, and see what's the difference in terms of engagement and learning rates. Now, one thing on a different project that I've had that's starting to infuse this project is at Stanford, I met some folks who are narratologists, which is a term I never even knew existed about a year ago. And these are essentially English professors who are expert in narrative and why they work and don't work. And they're really interested in actually working on this project and being able to kind of contribute to making better narratives. But that's one of the research questions we're looking at. Another one is, how do we leverage context, things like location or objects, to make the story more engaging? And the original idea of this actually came from Griffin Dietz again. She said, I used to go geocaching with my dad all the time. She said, what if we could take geocaches, database, and depending on what geocache was near you, we could kind of make that somehow part of your story. And then when you go find that object, for example, that could be the way to unlock the next part of the story, or that could be the thing that causes you to time travel to this other place that you're going. And I really like that idea that we could use that something local to them that they had to kind of find to kind of make the story come alive, and also that it was outdoors and not just stuck in the home. So we looked at that a little bit. One issue we found is the geocache people who used to have an API have locked it down, and they're trying to make money on this thing. So it was unclear whether we could actually use geocaching. And then after we were working on this for a little while, at least a year or two, Pokemon came out, and then we started to think, well, you could do like that in terms of using landmarks as the way of unlocking things. And then finally, we wanted to think about how to use features in the real world as part of activities. So for example, let's say you have a brick wall near your house. Maybe we might do some math estimation tasks where we want them to estimate the number of bricks here without counting them all, or something like this, or how many leaves are on all the trees on your block by learning how to estimate. So that's one thing we've been working on, is kind of the context part. And also we've all been working on using augmented reality as another way of tying the story that you read on a tablet to you're now out in the field doing some activity. How do we keep the story connected to what you're doing at that point? So one way of doing that is having some augmented reality that just adds some of the elements to the story to the physical world, but that's still kind of early work. And then the last area we had worked on from that initial research was when the kids were doing some of those learning activities, occasionally they'd get stuck. And we had a researcher there, so we could maybe help them along and get them unstuck. Or if you were doing it in a classroom, you might be able to get a teacher to help you. Or maybe if you're doing it with other kids, maybe somebody else helps. But what would we do if a kid was using this by themselves and they get stuck? And so one thing we've looked at is, can we use a chatbot as a way to kind of guide you when you get stuck? And can we somehow make an effective chatbot by targeting a particular problem domain? So this is more of the technical issue of how do you make a chatbot it's actually going to work, versus just something that has funny conversations with you but doesn't know anything that would actually help you. So we're not the only ones who think that a chatbot might work. There's some people like Bill Gates in this quote think that chatbots might be a useful thing in tutoring. We think that the natural language processing technology has advanced enough recently, and in fact some of the biggest advances were right here at Google, to think that we can start to process text and use it effectively in chatbots, and we wanted to explore some of this. So for example, in a domain-specific chatbot, we're trying to not necessarily make a general purpose agent, but something that can help them with specific activities. So for example, in that learning about density and volume, we could just write a lot of hard-coded rules for a chatbot to solve it, but that means like for every activity we ever would write, we have to kind of do this. And so we wanted to see how would we kind of more semi-automatically do this. For example, could we just point a learning system at, let's say, the Wikipedia page for density and learn enough from that to be able to answer and ask questions about it. So like, what are the units of density if the kid were to ask that, or how do I measure the volume, or what's density, or even in the more geocaching thing, what are coordinates? So that's something we've looked at a little bit, and we've tried to think about how do we integrate that into the activity itself. So if this kid was doing that task with estimating the candies, how might they be having a conversation with the chatbot, where the chatbot's helping them along? I'm not sure how to do it. Maybe they're gonna give them some hints along the way, and maybe they get an answer wrong, and then the chatbot can kind of tell them about possible flaws that they've taken. So that's the basic idea of that. We've also looked at how do we integrate the chatbot with the reading of the story itself. So should the chatbot only be there when you're doing one of these learning activities, or is the chatbot almost a narrator that's with the child throughout the experience? And we've gone back and forth on what we think is there. This is one design we've been playing with. We've also done some Wizard of Oz experiments with kids and chatbots, and seeing how they might interact to kind of learn this better. And here's one example that we explored. In this case, we got some content from an education company, really targeted at younger kids than we're really looking at. Right now we're looking at more like age 10-ish. This was probably books targeted towards early readers, kind of 5 to 7. The idea of this system was, could we recommend books for them to read based on their interests and learn their interests? And then also, could we quiz kids about the content that they read to see if they understood it? And so this chatbot that you're going to see in this video is kind of a hybrid. The casual chatting part of it is deep learning based, so it's all learned. And then the quizzing part are rules that we had to hard code in there about things to ask, but the answers that the student makes are checked kind of automatically using NLP algorithms. And what we've been trying to push this further is how to make this even more automated. So this gives you an idea of like the first one that we did.
Hello, Sally. Blue is of the color intermediate between green and violet, having a color similar to that of a clear unclouded sky. Howdy, Sally. I'm glad we've finally met. My name is Tangerine, and I'm here to help recommend a book for you to read. How old are you? Wow, you are already 10 years old. Are you a girl or a boy? Okay, so you're a girl. Are you looking for some light reading or more challenging reading today?
A light reading, please.
What would you like to learn more about?
Animals and people.
All right, would you like to read Pond Animals together? Hello, this is the chatbot. Hi there.
What are your hobbies? ?
I like drawing and painting.
Tell me a joke, please.
Here is a funny one. I was going to tell you a joke about an unsharpened pencil, but never mind. It was pointless.
What time is it?
It is 9:51 a.m.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Hello, this is the QuizBot. I'm going to quiz you on some book we read.
Okay.
Would you like to have a little quiz about this book?
Yes.
Here's a question for you. This book is mostly about blank.
Colors.
Correct. Good job. Would you like another question about this book?
Yes.
Here's a question for you. The perk is the blank in this story.
Setting.
Correct. Good job. Would you like another question about this
We
book?
wanted to then try to do this a little more seriously at how might we build some automated quizzing technology using NLP. So we kind of stepped back trying to see if we could find a compelling case where this might be useful today. And here we wanted to look at how we might help older kids or even adults who are studying factual knowledge, so learning vocabulary or facts for an exam, like a driver's exam or something like this. We found that a lot of people complained about existing kind of flashcards just being boring. So we wanted to see, can we do something better? So the basic idea is, could we use a chatbot to boost engagement and learning in this kind of application where you're just trying to learn some factual knowledge? So a little different than our basic smart primer idea, but we wanted to work on some of the underlying AI for this. So this is what the interface looks like. So you're going back and forth. The system can ask you questions, you can answer, you type your answer in. If you're unsure and you need a hint, you can ask for a hint, and in that case, we'll give you a multiple choice, like a normal multiple choice question, but normally you're typing it in. And then also, if you get an answer and you're unsure why is that the right answer, because you got it wrong, you can get a longer explanation. So that's the basic interaction of that chatbot. And then what we did was well, first of all, we also built that with your standard, top flashcard underlying algorithm for doing optimal practice in terms of what questions you should show next to quiz the learner. And then at the same time, we built a flashcard program that looks like some of the better ones out there, and we're able to use the same algorithms, the same questions to be able to kind of test it. So this is kind of a paper.
In this video, we present QuizBot, a dialogue-based adaptive learning system that uses modern AI techniques and fun conversation to help students learn factual knowledge. This new conversational AI-based interaction can make factual knowledge learning more engaging and effective. To evaluate QuizBot, we compared it with the flashcard app that we built and ran 2 within subjects.
Our results suggest underlying stuff. So here's the basic idea. Can we use dialogue to learn this kind of factual knowledge? Use interactive chat as NLP to be able to tell whether your answer is the right answer, and then the question selection algorithm is the standard kind of best of breed that you'll find in flashcards, and then we have this animated avatar, and you can ask for hints or explanations just like you can in a flashcard. Now, one of the big differences is in the flashcards, you're just answering flashcards back and forth, and you're deciding yourself whether you got the answer right or wrong. It asks you a question, you go, oh, yeah, that's right, I know that. Whereas in this, you are typing the answer, and then we're checking whether the answer is right or wrong. But the difference is kind of recall in some ways versus recognition. You say, yeah, that's what I got. And so there's something there. Another difference is you can actually chat with the chatbot about things that aren't being quizzed of you. So it has some general chatbot in there that you can just interact with. And we'll find that in the results, people actually don't just do the studying with the chatbot, they also kind of play around with it. So there's some engagement that people find there. So we did 2 within subject studies comparing these two, where essentially we tried to control the algorithms and the data to be totally even. We made sure that the questions that are asked in either case are kind of equivalent in difficulty. And this is what we found out. So we're really interested in 2 things. One, effectiveness of learning, and then second, engagement. So what's interesting is we found that if we did a fixed number of items practiced in both conditions, we found that people recognized and recalled over 20% more correct answers with QuizBot. So the way we tested them was we did a pre-test, and then anything you got wrong in the pre-test, in the post-test, we asked you to essentially fill in the blank those answers, and then we did multiple choice on those afterwards. So that was recognition. So recall first, then recognition. And we found, again, people did better with QuizBot when we fixed the number of items practice. Now that's kind of interesting why we fixed it. We wanted to have a fair comparison, but the fact is QuizBot, I don't know what the number is, it's like 3 to 5 times slower, right? You can do flashcards really fast, typing takes longer, and then people also engage with the agent. So this one kind of is unfair to flashcards in terms of total time. So we did another study 2, where we gave them voluntary usage time. They could pick however much time they wanted to spend, and it's within subjects that had both of these, and we found that even with that, people could recognize a similar amount, so on the multiple choice, but they did recall 12% more better if they had to type it in. And what was interesting about both of these results is they held 1 week later when we tested them, another post-test, and then we did it again 1 month later, and this was about 40 subjects in each of these 2 different experiments, 2 separate, 40. So the results seem to hold. They obviously get a little narrower over time, and you do get worse, as you would expect, but there was still a gap that was statistically significant. In terms of engagement, people spent about 2.5 times longer on QuizBot of their own volition when they had kind of the choice of which one to spend the time on, and they were, compensated the same amount for the study. And then if you ask them about engagement subjectively in both studies, they prefer QuizBot statistically in both cases. And if you ask them for what, it's kind of interesting because then the time factor comes in. They said, if I have a test tomorrow kind of thing, then they really prefer flashcards. But anything else in terms of learning over time, they thought that QuizBot was more interesting. Now, there obviously can be novelty effects in this kind of thing, since it's only about a week-long study, but the results were pretty substantial for this kind of study. So that's the one that we've done the deepest. I wanted to just kind of pop back up to kind of what the high-level goals of the system were again, and then talk about where we are in terms of different pieces of it. So the QuizBot's like the one thing we've evaluated the most, but now we're back to, okay, we're building kind of the version 2 of the higher level smart primer, and some of that QuizBot technology might go into kind of where we do questions and answers in there. So these are the goals again, narrative based. We want it to be personalized to the student, aware of context, use activities that are in the real world, using chatbots, Q&A to help the student that get stuck, and potentially crowdsource feedback for some of the more subjective kind of things that we can't do with machine learning. Haven't really got to that last one, and some of these others some are done more than others, but I'll show you some as we go. So in terms of who is this for, the original envisionment for me was kind of like 1st to 6th grade. Why 1st grade? I didn't want to deal with having to teach people to read. And why 6th grade? Because once you get past that, I think kids will get bored by this kind of thing and totally want to be fully much more of in kind of a gamer world than this. Right now, we're scoping more to 4th to 6th grade just to kind of make it something we can deal with. We just can't do that many different versions at once. And I want to be able to show one version where we show engagement and learning effects, and then see about how we scale it. In terms of content, we've been focused on math, science, reading, and writing, but there's other useful skills like music, social science, etc. But again, in terms of making this something doable, we're focusing more on the first 4. Usage scenario is kind of informal learning in the home. This is not meant as, oh, this is going to replace what you do at school, teachers are going away, or anything like that. It's really meant just to find another place where a kid can get engaged in learning, and maybe that motivates them more when they are in school, because they find a different way of getting interested in different topics. And again, it's narrative driven. You might say there's even some gamification. I don't necessarily like that term, but depending on what you do with feedback, it can be called gamified. And so just to walk through some of the pieces again, right now we have this idea of a chapter is kind of a story and a learning module, and that chapter fits into a map that might have 5 or 6 different chapters that are kind of connected together, and then they might all fit a map into several maps in the smart criminal world that might have multiple maps, and they're kind of different adventures. So I might think of, in the Magic Treehouse kind of scenario, is one of these different maps might be a different book almost, that you went on a different adventure, but there's characters that are shared between it and other things. So if we look at a chapter, we've kind of thought of them as of the size where we might have 1 to 3 skills that you try to learn in that chapter, and there might be 1 to 3 different educational tasks for teaching these skills. So they might be something that you did directly there on the tablet, or there might be some activities with household objects, or there might be something where you went out into the world and did something. And then that chapter story ties into the main storyline, and then your conversational character or agent is a character in the story as well as a tutoring agent. And like I said earlier, that's something we've gone back and forth on. Is that agent just to help you, or is that agent actually part of the story? And that's something I actually don't know the answer, and that's something as we do these Wizard of Oz experiments with kids, we're testing to try to see which works better. I've kind of personally gone back and forth what I think is the right way. In terms of adaptation, we're trying to be able to understand the different levels for different kids and adjust the difficulty along the way, so it's not too easy or not too hard. Again, some of the underlying AI research we've done is in knowledge tracing, being able to predict, given questions you've gotten right, whether you'll do the next question right or wrong. And in fact, that's a project just on the knowledge tracing that I'm collaborating with Wei over in Google Cloud AI. And he's been working with us for about the last year on that. And so when you get the start of a chapter, like I showed you the one before, there's a newer version of it running on Android. It starts with a story that has a bigger narrative to set the state of the world, and then you and the partner are like main characters. And then you might have these learning tasks, like the candy one we saw, but now with adaptive hints. So if the kid didn't, can you tell me the number of candies that fill on the whip? And then if they don't really get it right, then we might say, hey, you need to, figure out the dimensions and do that. And then working with NLP, for example, when we have people write about things. So this one's about doing the census of the forest. One of the stories we have is like an ecological story. And so the student filled out this table, and then they wrote something about evidence of why they think the number of fires are increasing. We can do some NLP on that to see how well they understood it. The other one that we've been working on a lot, but haven't implemented a lot yet, more of design, is trying to think about how can we use locations and landmarks and have the student go to those places, which then unlock other parts of the story. I'm kind of the mind that I want them to do something at those places rather than just, hey, I went to the place and so the story continues. This version that you see there kind of looks more of a just unlock it, which I think is not good enough. But again, that's why we're still playing with designs. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, there's kind of a summary about what you've learned and the concepts. And then you might also get some skill feedback. And maybe that's where there's some gamification in terms of virtual coins or badges or things like that. Again, how to exactly do that, I'm unsure, but this is like the current design that the designer on the team has played around with. The last thing I was going to show you before the technical pieces is just what's the underlying curriculum. So we had a learning science graduate student try to map out a whole set of chapters and doing this kind of forest map, and then they had these different topics like biology, physics, math, geography, history, and then worked across it. Now I actually found when I looked at this that it was too much, but this student actually came up with a whole bunch of different things that, the 3 things or so that they were going to learn from each of those steps through that, through the different chapters in that story. So we're going back and forth in terms of, is that too much to cover? Again, the way for us to tell this is to kind of build it and test it, and we're at this stage of building it. And then the last piece is kind of, as you start to do this, how do you scale it? Now, usually I would do this last, but I have some AI students working on the project, and they immediately are like, oh, how do we start building the real algorithm? So we have some students, in fact, Google's hired one of them. She's joining Google Brain when she graduates in June, who's been working on how can we do information extraction to figure out what are interesting points of interest on a map. So she's using geolocation and a map to find information, and then she's getting content out of Wikipedia about points of interest, and then using logical regression to figure out, is that of educational value, or is it related to the interests of the students, to kind of automatically figure out some of these things. I'm unsure how well that works because we haven't tested it, but she's been working on that. We've also been using potentially AR to guide you towards one of these POIs. Again, I'm more interested in the AR being able to bring something into the story at the POI rather than the navigation. But this is one student who's played around with that a little bit. And then another thing that AI students have been doing is, can we actually extract information to know what's interesting to know about that POI? So if you're on the Stanford campus, you might see these rodent bronzes. Can we automatically create that? And she's actually been doing some good algorithms work on automatically extracting that information. I'm not going to show you any of those results, but they're pretty good. And she's got some publicity on some of this work. And then finally, can use some of the similar algorithms to actually do question generation. So can we automatically generate questions? These are things that are all about, can you scale this up and not have to have people create all of this content and all of the questions. I'm not convinced yet whether you can do it automatically versus do you need people. And we'll see as we push ahead. So that's kind of an overview of the project. I just want to give you an idea of where the funding came from. So when we really started to work on this seriously a year ago, TAL, which is, I think at this point, the largest tutoring company in China, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, made a gift to my research group at Stanford to help fund the research. So they have an interest in kind of scaling up their teaching in China, where right now it's very classroom based on teachers after school and stuff, and they want to be able to do much more. And they're doing actually a lot of AI oriented things. So they've been funding this. But that's just an overview of the project that I wanted to give you time to ask questions about where we're at and where we're going.
Great.
And also, if any people on the Hangout have questions, feel free to barge in, but I'll take, do you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you. A couple of questions. One, what is your sense of the form factor that students would use with a tutor like this one?
Yeah.
So would it be like a computer like this, or would it be tablets, or we don't know yet?
I've been thinking, so originally I thought tablet, but I would think tablet or phone or phablet. You know, laptop I worry is too big to kind of do a lot outside, and I think will limit what you would do. But I think that would depend on what kind of actual activities we come up with. But my envisionment has always been, I and many other parents I speak to don't want our kids stuck behind another screen because they're doing that all day already. And so we kind of want to get them outside. So to me, it's got to be pretty mobile. That's why originally it was tablet, but sometimes I start to think, oh, maybe it's phone, maybe it's me with my bad vision going, oh, I can't read this stuff on phone, but maybe, 10-year-olds with their super eagle eyes have no problem with a lot of content on us 5-inch phone. So I think kind of phone to tablet is kind of much more. I'm doing tablet right now because that for us is probably easier to design for. I think the smaller you get, the design gets harder. So I think just to make it easier for us to develop something and test it, that's probably what we're doing. And also we can get them usually a slightly more powerful platform that way.
I was also wondering, like, I love that you tested with some different types of learning environments.
Yeah.
And what would be the effects on text or virtual reality or video? Like any of those effects, would be very interesting.
So I haven't tested that carefully, and I've actually been wary. So the AR stuff is mainly I have a student, and he's totally into building AR stuff, and I said, hey, go do some interesting things. Let's see if we can do it. There's been this question, and the students bring this up, is will kids read? Or do they need something that's much more like animation, games? my claim have kind of attacked this two ways. One, I think people will still read, and that kind of getting people to read is part of the goal, and getting their imagination to be active is what happens from reading, because you have to kind of make up a lot of that in your head. But two, it's also a practical thing. In a university research project, even with how kind of animation and other tools have become much easier, I just don't think I can compete with gaming companies, and the quality of the visuals that they're going to be able to create is just, you know, it's not like Hollywood movies in terms of the budgets, and I'll never be able to do that in university. So I'm just like, yeah, that might be a good idea, but I just can't even go there to do it. So I've been focused on, can we have text with some images, and then trying to take advantage of the real world and the AR as the way to kind of make it engaging. Now, it may not work for every kid, and so we may fail. The key to me is, will it work for some kids that didn't get appeal from kind of traditional learning? If it's just the same kids who are already going to do well in the regular school, then we've kind of failed.
Right.
But we don't know until we do it. But I agree there are other ways that may be better if we have the budget. Yeah.
And have you looked into procedural narrative at all?
You mean like automatically generated narrative? I've looked into it in that one of the top people in that is a guy at UC Santa Cruz, who I knew actually in graduate school at CMU, Michael Matias. And when I've looked at it, it was unclear to me whether you could create good enough stories yet, but I do think that's going to be a hostile way of generating. I'm still not sure. I mean, I've also looked at crowdsourced narrative, and most of those things seem like they failed. From what I've seen, they're not very good. I've also thought about, could we just find the best books that we know and license the content? So for example, there's a book that if you haven't seen called The Number Devil, which teaches math. And I relearned about it when I was reading The Diamond Age. I did a thing I never thought I would do as a computer science professor. I felt like an English professor. I had a little reading group with 6 undergraduates, and we sat around the table and we read the novel together over several weeks, and we actually tried to extract the spec of what was this thing. And one of the students said, "Oh, you gotta get this book, The Number Devil. It's really great. I learned about Fibonacci series and all this math." And I said, "Oh, that sounds really familiar." And then I realized that, oh yeah, my son had read that book when he was like 7, and we were living in Beijing like 10 years before, or 8 years before. And I pulled it out again, and it's an incredible book in that it is a narrative, yet it has math totally embedded in the story, such that my kid was like doing Fibonacci up to 10 Fibonacci sequence in his head from reading that book. So it's possible you might find just good ones that you can then imagine kind of building in this way if we could license it. That's another way. I haven't solved how to get the stories yet. I want to see if I can show that it works with 1 or 2 stories, and then decide, okay, how do you scale? Yeah.
2 questions. One is a follow-on to the first question about interfaces.
Yeah.
What progress is being made to generalize this for other interfaces, to expose it as a service or an API, apart from the UIs that it's also paired with?
Yeah, I would say nothing. I mean, to me, that's not the concern. Like, for me, you want to first make sure the thing I get works, and then go, okay, how would I make it more accessible, scale it up, etc. Others have said, oh, you got to do all the personalization stuff now. Like, how do you make it personal to every kid? I've kind of felt like, yeah, I only want to do as much personalization as I need to prove I can make one version that wins in some ways. And so the next step we're really working on right now is doing a study where doing some activities with just activities versus activities with story versus activities with chatbot versus activities with, say, just hints, to show does the stories and chatbot help or not. Because if it doesn't, I might as well just close up shop and work on something else. So I'm trying to get the basic, yes, this works, before I go, how do you scale?
Then the other question was taking the gamification aspect of it, is there any work being done by your team or associated teams to modify the world as part of the player's experience, or is it so far still?
You mean to personalize it to what's going on?
Not even just to personalize it. I'm thinking more like like Zork or games where the world changes as you interact with it.
I haven't thought about the world itself changing as much as you go to other pieces of the world that somebody's designed. But,
So that's still maybe a couple generations.
yeah, I mean, well, we have definitely thought about personalization of the world in that the story is somehow different based on a few different variables, based on where you live or how many kids are in your family or what your mom does for work or what the weather is like today. So some things like that where it might be just adaptive to what's your context, but nothing where like you're doing anything more than that.
If I open a cabinet, it doesn't stay open the next
Yeah, nothing like that at this point.
You mentioned a couple times just now, just wanting to see if it works. What does works mean to you? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so that's a good question. What does works mean? So for me, it has been one traditional way is we give you some standard educational test and we show that you learn. A, that would probably be the minimum. 2 would be that you learn more with this versus some other way. That's a slightly higher bar. I've also been interested in engagement. Just, are you more engaged? Are you more interested in doing this? Because for me, yeah, I could sit you down and make you do some worksheets and stuff and you might learn, but maybe the kid just doesn't want to do that. So learning and engagement are kind of 2 different variables that we're looking at. And so I think the basic is if I just give it and compare it to some standard way, we would teach you something or have you learn. Does it engage you more or do you learn more?
And have you thought about applying some of what you're doing to maybe non-standard academic curriculum? There's a lot of thought in the educational spheres around like non-content knowledge, but more metacognitive knowledge or SEL or habits.
So I do think we're interested in that for 2 reasons. One is in some ways we want to look at different curriculum, but we also want to look at curriculum where it's more of exposure than mastery. So Dan, Dan Schwartz, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education, is really cautioned against, hey, don't make it like, oh, you got to get this problem right, and only if you get that right do you move on to the next part. So we've looked at more things that are fuzzier in some ways in how they do it and assessing it, and think about it's just kind of getting kids engaged and exposed rather than, hey, we showed you can do this level of math or something like that, and leave that to the traditional learning method. So we've thought about that. Now there's a reason a lot of these educational researchers do things like math, because it's really easy to check. Now, as we started to do more of the NLP stuff, I was actually pretty amazed at how well the flashcard stuff worked in terms of it can interpret people's typing and whether they got the answer right or wrong. And we checked that by both looking at logs, but also we had the people self-report, like, you marked me wrong and I was right. And it worked pretty well. So the NLP, I think, is going to allow us to get into a lot more of these fuzzier areas that a lot of education researchers have avoided just because it's too hard to check. Math is easy to check. An area we're working on right now, this is the one collaborative we're way here at Google is working on, we're using Duolingo data sets, so looking at language learning. It gets a little more fuzzier than some of these topics. But some of these other life skills, I had some of them there in that one slide, because they actually are in the Smart Primer. She learns about survival skills and stranger danger and other things that you wouldn't think about, oh, that's what they're teaching at school. So we're interested, but I think we're doing some of the traditional things first because they're easier to just kind of show that you've done something and make it improve. But I don't think we're tied to those.
Let me interrupt and thank you for coming by, James. Really great talk. Appreciate it.